Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushel.
All right, Jeremy. So, 2 shows ago, I believe, it may have been our last show. No, it was 2 shows ago that we talked about the Pittsburgh the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting of this mass shooting of Jewish worshippers at this synagogue in Pittsburgh, and we discussed in relation to this a lot of the ways that we see the way that conspiracies are discussed in our society, the way that like this narrative of the Jew and Jewish power, or even things outside of that, such as the threat of Islam taking over, the threat of, in a lot of ways, of communism and this left wing, radical leftism that ties in with communism, or if you want to call it cultural Marxism or whatnot, and this whole idea of coming in line with multiculturalism and just this idea of wanting to basically destroy the West and overrun with refugees. And we talked about among other things, kind of this boogeyman caricature of George Soros as this ultimate string puller financier of all things wicked and nefarious. And one of the things we talked about in relation to Soros and also this Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society was how the way that these things have been discussed and the way that the narratives have been set up within more kind of the far right kind of conspiracy oriented whether it's the openly anti-Jewish types or whether it's the more philo-Semitic pro-Zionist types, where I think so many of their narratives just come together and are indistinguishable in a lot of ways. You have the way that these narratives are constructed and set up, and the way the information is disseminated and put out is designed in a way that actually takes legitimate issues, but in the process very much waters them down instead of getting an actual like real understanding or real kind of discourse on how power structures work and operate. You rather instead get this much more watered down version that just simply relies on the elevating of individual boogeymen, and also is done in a way to divide society on racial lines, on gender lines, on cultural lines, which is so much of what is shaping this current discourse we're finding ourselves into. So I guess with this show, I'd like to follow up on that and go more in a historical direction, because we did a previous show where we kind of talked about I think we've discussed the weaponization of the whole Pizzagate narrative and this deep state narrative, everything from the evils of the deep state and all the policies they're saying to be pushing, which is also always the anti-Trump types, and everything from pedophilia and this idea of elites committing criminal actions against children, and just how weaponized it's been, and in a way that it simply deflects blame to one side of this power structure that's in place, this controlled kind of mechanism. And also, on the other hand, by portraying the evil of this, in that way, it limits the scope. And also by portraying this side as being so evil, you also kind of get people into this far right conservative type of analysis of world events in a way that steers you in directions of things such as a very hard pro-Zionist direction, pro-Israel direction, and also a very pro-pseudo semi-nationalist perspective domestically. And so with that, I wanted to take this narrative and shed it even further, go back decades, actually, that this is not just something that's brand new. This is something that's gone on for decades. And one of the ways that conspiracy theorists, quote unquote, are discredited and are discredited and are mocked and ridiculed in our society is by portraying them as basically kooks and lunatics, and they're pushing these theories that can never be proven or really don't have that much real substance to them. And in a way, like, I've always been very much against the whole demonization of conspiracy theories, obvious reasons. But also I'm starting to understand that in a lot of ways it's intended to be this way by the disseminators of these conspiracies, whether we're talking about the alt-right and the openly anti-Jewish narratives, or the more or less philo-Semitic Zionist, traditional conservative nationalism, or whether you even get into the religious component of this with your Pat Robertson types writing about the New World Order back in the early 90s. You've had this long constructed, I think very carefully put in place um, discourse and how these issues are discussed that has for a long time, and not something new. You can go back to the early 60s or even the 50s with the John Birch Society and even people like Roy Cohn and Joseph McCarthy. I think what we've had in place is a decades long, very carefully constructed, weaponized, watered down analysis of how power works in this world as far as the more conspiratorial basis of constructing narratives and power structures that I think has long been designed to not only deflect and only turn attention to a certain aspect of this power structure that's in place while running cover for the other side. But I think this has been a long constructed, it's been in place for many decades with the design of, even by the people that are pushing these theories, to make people that seriously question their government and the nature of false flags and of false paradigms designed to control over society to look like unhinged nuts and lunatics and crazy people and everything the media would like people to believe conspiracy theorists are. So, Jeremy, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think this is a very one of the key topics of our time, especially in contemporary United States of America. And I think we've talked about before the idea of strategy of tension as a historical concept that ties into the idea of an orchestration or a curation or a cultivation of a political landscape that's actually drives the extremes in many ways against each other. If you think about it as left and right, and I believe left and right as a political description actually comes from the wake of the French Revolution, I believe, in terms of where people sat, and it describes that kind of background. So, of course, there is this idea that we are encountering a political landscape that is a few hundred years old in terms of descriptions in many ways, but then also that things are being used in terms of these constructions of political ideology of pitting the left and the right against each other while accentuating the extremes at the same time as the actual planning, conspiratorial orchestration of significant terrorist events by covert, state sponsorship of some sort. And whether these state-sponsored operations go all the way to the top, which often they do, it looks like, or whether they are, what might be titled rogue groups that are working to stage these events, sort of is maybe besides the point in terms of actually doing an analysis of what the nature of that artificial political reality constructed to turn the ends against the middle in many ways actually is. And so I think we brought up in the past that if we think through the idea of the strategy of tension in the Operation Gladio in the wake of World War II in the European context, and CIA and NATO intelligence driving false flag bombings that were actually that really were terrorism, meaning that they were directed, not only the target of the actual violence was civilians, but the target of the political desire was the civilian mind state in many ways. And so, thinking about this as that this kind of strategy of tension and the orchestration of terror and terrorized mind states, we should actually begin to further develop this idea in an intellectual, even maybe a purely political or intellectual context. So thinking about the mainline extreming or the construction of reactionary or extreme boxes at both ends of what's been termed the left-right political spectrum, as an orchestration of intellectual violence in many ways. And rather than actual, real intellectual friction or the clash of ideas, maybe what we might term it, rather than the clash of civilizations, as termed by the sort of modern neoconservative movement, it's something that we should really hone in on. And so I just want to quote briefly from this idea of the strategy of tension from a mainstream source, Wikipedia. And so from the Wikipedia page, a strategy of tension, Italian, strategia della tensione, is a policy wherein violent struggle is encouraged rather than suppressed. It is usually associated when governments or security apparatuses within a government allow or even encourage extremist groups to perform attacks, bombings, murders, and the like. In extreme circumstances, it can even involve agent provocateurs and false flag operations where a terrorist threat is outright invented or created. The goal in such strategies is that such a struggle will rally support behind the military or police forces opposing the radicals, to radicalize opposing movements so that they can be better marginalized, or to permit loosely allied extremist groups to attack enemies of the government. As few organizations would openly say that they are pursuing a strategy of tension, accusations generally come from opponents that such a strategy is being pursued. And then one last little bit here, just to point out the actual historical context and background, being that this concept, it does come out of post-World War II Italy, and in a Cold War context, that there's a very specific background that does have to do with right-left politics in many ways. So this next paragraph, the strategy of tension is most closely identified with the years of lead in Italy from 1968 to 1982, wherein both far-left Marxist extremists and far-right neo-fascist groups performed bombings, kidnappings, arsons, and murders. Activists have accused NATO of allowing and sanctioning such terrorism, although this conclusion is hotly disputed. Other cases where writers have alleged a strategy of tension include the Turkish military against Islamists from the 1970s to the 1990s, Ergenekon, the war veterans, and the ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, which coordinated the farm invasions of 2000. The DRS security agency in Algeria from 1991 to 99, and Belgium's state security service from 82 to 86. And then it goes through all of the examples, which in the Italian context were very much about the communists versus the sort of far-right fascists, with both groups allegedly doing bombings, but then a lot of the time it looks like that the false flag aspects, meaning the deceptive terrorism, was done largely by intelligence agencies via some of the fascist organizations to be blamed on the left communists.
Yeah, and I think if honestly, I think that they're gonna have to add eventually, when you're really taking apart our modern history, honest research. I think perhaps, I don't know if there'll be some at Wikipedia who could add things, but certainly you're going to have to throw, I think, the current last few years of the United States of our history into this whole narrative of this strategy of tension and the pittings of the extremes of society against each other. 'Cause we're really seeing that in large numbers here in America, in a lot of ways, in a lot of European countries as well. And so I think we're going to have to eventually add that to what's going on here, because we're seeing that over the last couple of years. I unfortunately don't think we've seen it at its worst here in this country. So,
yes, and well, who knows? We are in the game, and that's one of the reasons to do this kind of political analysis, is for understanding and comprehension of the terrain to actually help to free people up. And so we begin to really take responsibility for our own political mind state. And I think more and more this growing awareness of how intensely our minds have been controlled and dictated, our politics, our political thought really dictated to us in ways that are pre-made in many ways and pre-packaged for us, and so beginning to learn about these kind of strategies that are deployed against us and our political minds, I think are crucial in many ways to the creation of our future and for getting us back in the game. And as we talked about a little bit in the our prior show about the elections, that it's very possible that even just sort of like assumptions that we have about political involvement or the nature of our understandings of economics or historical events, that a lot of this in many ways, whether it's sort of like the desire for us to feel helpless or confused, that these actually might be the purpose of certain forms of psychological warfare that are dependent upon these kinds of intellectual strategies of tension.
Excuse me. You're right, Jeremy. I really agree with you, and I would like to go back to this perhaps before we finish to this strategy of tension and kind of relate it to even modern events, current events. What's going on with like this, the RussiaGate, what we've kind of coined as Mobgate, what our friend Joseph Davis calls the New York, Tel Aviv, Moscow triangle. That is surrounding Trump at so many levels and surrounding other Western leaders, or even someone like a Vladimir Putin in a lot of ways, certainly a Viktor Orban and in Hungary, and obviously centered around Israel in so many ways, and is shaping so much of this more extreme pro-Israel kind of right wing, very militant policy against, say, the Palestinians, while also very much being, I think, more or less making up kind of the fifth column of the really extreme Zionist hardliners that are very, I think, have very subversive influence within, with this government. And I'd like to go back to the strategy of tension towards the end and how the extremes in our society are pitted against each other, but also in a lot of ways seem to really, in a lot of ways, kind of play off of each other in a strange sort of way, run cover for each other, even boost each other in a strange way. So I'd like to go back to that before we end. But in relation to kind of drawing a more kind of a parallel between modern, what we're seeing now with the state of discourse within conspiracy culture. And the reason why we're focusing so much on kind of the right wing, kind of the far right, is because conspiracy culture is very traditionally very, very right wing. And there's some more left, and might call conspiratorial based analysis of society, but no one, I don't think, comes at it from more kind of quote unquote left perspective, has nearly the type of platform or viability that so many of these InfoWars, for example, type of outlets have on the right wing. So very much traditionally been very right wing, conservative oriented conspiracy culture. So that's why we're focusing so much on the right here. But in terms of something that just happened that I think draws a very good parallel between the current state of our discourse and going back decades to maybe the days of the John Birch Society, as we alluded to earlier, is the case of Jerome Corsi. And Jerome Corsi, we've talked about him on numerous occasions on this program. Jerome Corsi has just recently announced that he expects to be indicted by Robert Mueller anytime here in the very near future. And it's interesting, we may do another show, I think, very soon, where we're going to get into perhaps more of the details of Jerome Corsi and also some of the other people whose names have recently popped up within the Mueller probe. But one of the ways that Jerome Corsi operates is that while he is very clearly a political hitman, as evidenced by his work in the 2004 campaign on behalf of George W. Bush against John Kerry, no matter how much InfoWars wants to rewrite history and pretend that this wasn't the case or whatever, or that they had to do it to basically stop the left or whatever they're saying with the 2000 Florida election that Roger Stone's rewriting history on. From the 2004 election to his work in portraying Obama as the Kenyan Muslim, and he was in Israel just as Obama was making that speech in Egypt where he was said to be apologizing for Islam and for condemning America for being a strong country, basically. So Corsi has this history as a political operative and also as the you might call him maybe what John Perkins would label perhaps an economic hitman at some level for the B'nai B'rith and some of the work that Mel Rockefeller detailed in his book or on his website, Hidden Tax on Humanity, that he did back, I believe, more in the 90s. So Jerome Corsi has this long history, but also Jerome Corsi very much dabbles into what we would describe as conspiracies, whether it's Obama's The Secret Muslim or anything else. So many of these more conspiracy minded tropes are very prevalent very central to Jerome Corsi, and also to the website that he used to be a correspondent for, WorldNet Daily, in addition to InfoWars, where he most recently was at. I'm not sure if he's at InfoWars anymore with all the current events going on.
Yeah, I did. I told you that I heard Alex Jones and Roger Stone sort of bad mouthing Corsi a couple weeks ago after this began to pick up steam, and when Roger Stone was actually talking about his own potential indictment, and it sounded like they were saying that Alex sounded like he was saying that Corsi had sort of gone over the deep end sometime after he'd named him DC bureau chief of InfoWars, and Roger Stone seemed to allege that there was a drinking issue in relationship to Corsi.
Oh. It just shows how cutthroat these people are and how they will throw you completely and abandon you if you become expendable. I think that's what that shows. But in any event, Corsi, both of the sites that he's worked with, that he has been synonymous with over the years, first WorldNet Daily and then InfoWars, have both very much dabbled in these, what you call conspiracies. And WorldNet Daily was always wasn't quite. It wouldn't go as far as InfoWars used to go, and I put an emphasis on used to in terms of exposing things like, obviously, the false flag nature of September 11th and also the Kennedy assassination. But WorldNet Daily's always very much been in line with this kind of this far-right worldview of conspiracy of multiculturalism and of the left, and of this narrative that the elites are really all leftists and they're communists and they're trying to just simply destroy our society, and that's what you need to know. And where the WorldNet Daily is the patriotic resistance against that. But Corsi's even written books about the John F. Kennedy assassination, and he basically him and Roger Stone kind of came together both on blaming mainly Lyndon Johnson and perhaps maybe elements of maybe the U.S. CIA or the intelligence community. And so Corsi has a background very much of dabbling into conspiracies, but what Corsi leaves out of anything he really discusses is the central role it seems to be in so many of these cases, well, of the nation of Israel, but also of this international network of operatives that we're seeing now that has become so prevalent for those who are really looking into the real merits of the actual Robert Mueller investigation, as well as what a lot of researchers have been putting pieces together of online, as well as people like Craig Unger in his new book, House of Trump, House of Putin, running cover for Israel and also for this international network of operatives going back to the Kennedy assassination. So you even have the Jerome Corsi types that are very much have played a key role in shaping our political elections from a propaganda perspective, are very much into this conspiratorial style of thinking. And I wanted to draw that in there as an example of what we're going, where you can see the past and the present come together in terms of shaping these narratives, and on one hand simply vilifying one side as being the source of all of the problems in our society, while on the other hand running cover for these much more for even people that are even at a deeper level directly involved with, such as the Kennedy assassination. Of course, you can even tie in perhaps one Roy Cohn into that, and Roy Cohn's involvement with Joseph McCarthy and maybe even the John Birch Society at some levels, very much the primary forefather, so to speak, or the precursor to what we're seeing now with the weaponized conspiracy narrative we see in so much of the alternative media that has taken an unprecedented amount of influence in the age of Trump, where I think really for the first time we're seeing these people actively supporting the person and the people sitting in positions of power within our government. So I wanted to tie that as an example of the past and the present coming together here. And I mentioned the John Birch Society, and Jeremy, you found some resources on going kind of into the history of the John Birch Society and the very much the Zionist bias and ultimate leaning of the John Birch Society, and even linking some very interesting names who have been very prevalent in shaping the career of people like Alex Jones in terms of his thinking and their possible connections to via an organization like the John Birch Society to more, I guess, nefarious means, which would show that JBS is not just simply an organization devoted to maintaining American sovereignty.
Yes, and before we get into that, I want to just follow up with this line of investigation that you've opened around Jerome Corsi, because I think it's a very it's a crucial line right now, and it's also very instructive about exactly what we are working to describe in relationship to the sort of right-wing John Birch type milieu surrounding this kind of really weaponized conspiratorial analysis. And some of that, I just want to get into some of these titles that Jerome Corsi had, some of the titles of his books that really lays out how appropriate it is that that you're bringing him up in this context. Because I do think not only is he obviously like a key political operative, both in terms of his work with InfoWars, where InfoWars becomes the key so-called grassroots platform to really, I think, elect Donald Trump, at least culturally in many ways. But then also Corsi's background as a hardcore Republican political operative in terms of his work, including in alliance with Roger Stone to the 2000 and 2004 Bush elections. So Jerome Corsi's written a lot of books, and he's actually recently in his broadcast, he's saying that it's because of the books that he writes and because he's pro-Trump is the real reason that he's in danger of being indicted by the special counsel. But meanwhile, we have him openly discussing things like getting information from foreign intelligence agencies, where he talks about Israeli intelligence live on air with Alex Jones and feeding that into domestic politics. And of course, that is the core of the Russia collusion investigation. But it also should be pointed out that that Mueller's special counsel mandate included not just a Russian collusion, but also any other matters that were related, which would also clearly involve things like other foreign involvement in the election in potentially illegal ways, which very much looks like a strong line to Netanyahu's Israel, which both people like Corsi and Roger Stone have a strong connection to. So let's go through some of these titles. So it looks like Corsi writes a book in 1972 called Prior Restraint, Prior Punishment, and Political Dissent. Then he follows it up in 1974 with a book called To Make the World Safe for Picnics about the 1972 political conventions. And then it looks like that about 30 years later, starting in 2004, is when he begins to really unleash a series of these really highly political books. And so, of course, the big first one of this new century, this post 9/11 world, is Jerome Corsi and John O'Neill, Unfit for Command. Swift boat veterans speak out against John Kerry, published by Regnery.
As you're mentioning these books here, real quick, it is interesting that while Corsi's dismissed as a gadfly and as just a kook and all this, it is interesting the disproportionate amount of media coverage he gets compared. His books have gotten over the years, particularly this one on the Swift boat with John Kerry, and also some of the later books he wrote on Obama. The disproportionate amount of media coverage they get in comparison to someone who would just be dismissed as simply a fringe lunatic by our mainstream media. So I just want to throw that in there.
And I want to point out, too, that this is the format of, let's say, of 2004, of this book being published before the upcoming presidential election between two skull and bones brothers, John Kerry and George W. Bush. it seems very related in many ways to these different categories that we've described around the 2016 election and this idea of weaponization on many levels, which means that we've talked a lot about Cambridge Analytica, and of course even people like Roger Stone put out multiple books during the year of the 2016 elections. But really Cambridge Analytica, this idea of the psychological warfare, the dialed in and psychometrically composed aspects of Cambridge Analytica, targeting via largely Facebook data of dozens of millions of American people and feeding them exactly what they needed to see in relationship to things like the apparent Russian involvement in the creation of these kinds of disinformation campaigns, is then also tied into this idea of actual hard material hacking potentially. We don't know necessarily yet exactly about 2016, but 2004, we know that one Mike Connell, Rove's IT guru, who, by the way, then also was working in the same time period with one Paul Manafort in Ukraine, apparently doing election rigging operations. But they were in the United States of America in conjunction, apparently, with Karl Rove, using computers, machine rigging of some sort, the 2004 election, with the epicenter in, of course, Ohio, the home state of one Ken Blackwell, who we'll see will pop up very quickly here. Okay, so moving on from that Rezhneri published Unfit for Command book, key to the psychological warfare context of the 2004 campaign, you have Corsi following it up after W's been reinstalled with Atomic Iran, how the terrorist regime bought the bomb and American politicians. And now he's moved on to being published by WorldNet Daily Books. Okay. That same year, he publishes a book with Craig Smith called Black Gold Stranglehold, the myth of scarcity and the politics of oil. So that's interesting too. So he's sort of covering a lot of these angles of what's considered this idea of the core of conspiracy theory. So energy politics, this idea of abiotic oil.
Yeah. Atomic Iran fits very much into what you saw with some of the more, the elements surrounding people like Dick Cheney and John Bolton in the Bush administration that were pushing for just really to extend the war on terror an official capacity to Iran in the later days that were fighting with other people within the administration. I think ultimately kind of lost the war that went on within there. So a book like Atomic Iran at that time by Corsi would fit right into that. The people who were pushing for regime change style operations in Iran as early as 2005 and 2006. So
that's a good point, and that also anticipates the timing of what we now know were actual machinations in a deep fashion in the United States of America and in the Middle East towards actual potential false flag operations in a large scale that looks like they were meant to facilitate some type of intensely destructive attack on Iran, potentially including things like nuclear bunker busters. That was the time period, I think 2006, 2007, when the nukes went missing from the Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota or South Dakota, and it's also the same time period where there was an apparently interrupted false flag actually potentially being organized via certain traitorous aspects of the commanding class of the U.S. Navy out of Bahrain. And people like a whistleblower like Gwyneth Todd, who was on the National Security Council at one point and who's now apparently had to leave the country because of this kind of whistleblowing, was there to apparently stop these kind of machinations. So once again, you can see Jerome Corsi playing the psychological warfare component, the anticipation component that's then meant to be backed up and bookended by actual the actual military operation side of things, whether it's machine hacking or computer rigging in relationship to elections, or the actual organization of potential military-based false flags that end up in actual potential violent attacks against another country. So I think that's key. That's a key propaganda book in terms of the timing, and we are blessed to have very likely avoided that potential reality that looks like it was being laid out by these kind of people. So then after that, we mentioned this black gold stranglehold, the abiotic oil, that there are real questions about these kinds of things. Fletcher Prouty, the guy who was the intermediary between the Pentagon and the CIA back during the early 60s, and who plays Mr. X he's the background character for Mr. X in Oliver Stone's JFK film, of course, reminder, funded, produced via Israeli military nuclear intelligence, technical intelligence operative Arnon Milchan. So that, of course, points at certain things that are being probably financed to be kept out of there. But Fletcher Prouty actually has opened up some interesting questions about the issue of oil, abiotic oil. But once again, I would just point out that this, I believe, is also a limited hangout or a red herring from the real deeper energy issues, which have to do with things like advanced black energy technologies, such as things like the legacy of Tesla or electromagnetic gravitics, or even when you go and look at the 5,000 patents that are being sat upon under national security, supposedly, and some of it's just highly effective, efficient solar panels. So I think that it sort of shows that there's a tendency here in Corsi to raise these so-called conspiracy questions in ways that usually will either do a red herring and send you in the wrong path, or will limit the actual hangout of the conversation. So then after that, you have Jerome Corsi and Ken Blackwell. Both, I don't know if Corsi's CMP, Council for National Policy, but Blackwell definitely is.
I believe Corsi was on that list that was leaked out, I believe, by the SPLC. I think Corsi was on there. I know that Ken Blackwell certainly is, but so many people in that entire network are Council for National Policy, so it would make sense for Corsi to be very much, at the very least, aligned with the bigger goals of a think tank like the Council for National Policy. So, and
Blackwell not only being the key state-level operative in relationship to the stolen 2004 election in Ohio, of course, popped back up again in relationship to 2016 when he was put on this voter integrity panel of some sort, commission with one Chris Kobach, on the heels of Donald Trump insisting that the reason he didn't win the popular vote was because of over 3 million fraudulent based on so-called illegal immigrant votes. And that thing has since folded, and so clearly Blackwell is still a player in the mix and in the midst of all of these kinds of evolving programs. So then after that, you have this really well-known one that he did. That book was called Rebuilding America, A Prescription for Creating Strong Families, Building the Wealth of Working People, and Ending Welfare, also by WND Books. Sounds like a good idea. I don't know what was in there. Jerome Corsi, The Late Great USA, the coming merger with Mexico and Canada, right? The North American Union is coming, right? I mean, how key was that at that time in 2007 when you had...
I was going to say real quick in relation to this book, one of the primary disseminators, actually, I think the primary person on television, I remember this because I used to somewhat follow him back in 2007, that was pushing this North American Union was one Lou
Lou
Dobbs, who
Dobbs.
CNN is now on Fox Business, and it was Lou Dobbs who was disseminating with Judicial Watch guy the theory, George Soros funded the caravan. And they had all this proof and throwing out the alleged anti-Semitic trope that it was the Soros-operated government, a play on the old Zog term, Zionist-operated government. And Corsi has been said to be perhaps at some level an advisor to Lou Dobbs. And I'm not sure if that's entirely true, but that is, you see the rise of this whole North American Union narrative, which was pushed primarily through websites like WorldNet Daily and InfoWars, and even through Lou Dobbs at CNN, who eventually was fired from CNN, I guess, for being too outspoken, and then ends up on Fox Business Channel as a primary proponent of Donald Trump and pushing the anti-Soros type of conspiracy type of talking points.
Yes, and then in terms of timing of this, I remember at this time the rising of the We Are Change network, and in terms of my personal experience of We Are Change LA, I was wary at first of actually. We knew that we wanted to create a local sort of think and act activist group locally in Los Angeles to begin to be able to take like organized, effective action in relationship specifically to things like 9/11 Truth. But then there was a strong push for us to start a chapter of We Are Change. And although I was wary of that, I thought maybe we should actually just form our own thing, name our own thing. We could still work in relationship or coordinate with the We Are Change network, but I thought it might be wise to individuate or separate ourselves out from that. But I went along with the creation of We Are Change LA, but I was very wary of the close hooking up of We Are Change with InfoWars right in that time. And it's definitely one thing that I still to this day am a little bit, I've got angst about that a lot of these We Are Change LA videos that I had some role in producing in some way have the InfoWars tag to them in some way. And so this is the very same time that I noticed that there was this strong push it looked like the aspects of We Are Change network, countrywide, even worldwide, was being pushed away from 9/11 Truth as the focus, which was in its founding documents, in terms of its mission statement, to talking about things mainly focused around the idea of this sort of whole slew of what you might describe as the New World Order conspiracy theories, which included things, the Bilderberg Group, things like people stopped asking about things around 9/11 and started asking things about, were you violating the Logan Act when you attended the Bilderberg conference, and things like the North American Union. And so I sort of see this now looking that Corsi became the DC bureau chief in the age of Trump for InfoWars. You really begin to see that there was this intellectual propaganda push in many ways towards a focus on the threat of the North American Union. NAFTA had already been passed. It was already an economic North American Union that was basically a race to the bottom in many ways, after things like labor laws and environmental laws had really been looted from that agreement.
And even I'll even mention this, that the primary focus in a lot of ways, at least in the eyes of the public, was this whole fear-mongering about the North American Union and scaring people about that, at least from someone like Lou Dobbs. The primary message people got out of this is that the damn illegals are coming in to take our country over, and we've got to stop them. So that plays in that. And I'll even mention real quick, this is kind of a side note, but also relates to this, that someone like a John Bolton, who's kind of seen as like a neocon, and he's, in a lot of ways, he is a target for some of the pro-Trump people that are critical of Trump's foreign policy. You'll see John Bolton criticized, like, oh, he's not following the Trump doctrine or whatever. But even someone like Bolton, who was pushing a lot represented this wing of hardliners in the Bush administration. They really wanted to take action against Iran in the second part of the Bush administration. Bolton was recently was coming out in the media siding with Trump over sending troops to the border. So Bolton, even from a more domestic perspective on his perspective on these kinds of issues, would be much more in line with this kind of more Jerome Corsi InfoWars WND style of perspective, even on an issues related to domestic policy. So I want to throw that in there as well.
Yes, thank you for doing that. And so then continuing on here, then we're starting to move into the Obama years, right? So it's 2008, Jerome Corsi, The Obama Nation, Leftist Politics and the Cult of Personality. And so, and although probably Jerome Corsi, if he were intellectually honest, he would have written a book in 2016 called The Trump Nation, Right-Wing Politics and the Cult of Personality, which is obviously, there's so much of the Trump movement that is all about the cult of his personality and how he's, outside of the norm, and he thumbs his nose and he attacks, and his, his way of calling people names. I mean, it's obviously, we've talked about this so many times, in that many ways that Trump really is the perfectly psychometrically, psychosocially tuned figure for the aspects of the right wing that are very similar to the way that Obama was the perfectly tuned to that moment coming in the wake of George W. Bush for aspects of the for the left and the liberals. So that's interesting. So then the next year, 2009, Corsi publishes America for Sale, Fighting the New World Order, Surviving a Global Depression, and Preserving USA Sovereignty. Right, okay. Then he publishes the Shroud Codex in 2010. I don't know what that is. That sounds like sort of maybe in the realm of like the things like Bible code, or, understanding the Illuminati code or something like that. I don't know what exactly that's about. Then 2011, now moving into the second election of, between Obama and then Romney. Where's the birth certificate? The case that Barack Obama is not eligible to be president. WorldNet Daily Books. And once again, I would point out that I actually believe there is, contrary to what the large portion of basically everyone in the mainstream and the aspects of the progressives and the left believe, that this was just all a hoaxed, made-up controversy about Obama's background and the birth certificate. I actually don't believe that's true. And from my best apprehension that I can tell, it looks like Obama, that it's very possible that his Hawaiian birth certificate was manufactured in many ways, but it was because he was born in Kansas to a mother who was married who was dating a black man in high school, and that man and his two friends had apparently been murdered by Ku Klux Klan affiliated types and thrown into the Kansas River, the Kaw River, and their bodies had floated up on the shore, down towards Lawrence on the way from Topeka, and that Obama is very much he's very American, and in fact that he represents a lot of the border wars and the aspects of the deep tension of the Civil War, and a white mother from a CIA family background, and a black father, and dating when there was a lot of tension around it and potential violence as a result. And it looks like that Obama's mother's family, the CIA part of his family, orchestrated a way to get her and her unborn baby out of town because of the amount of violence that was rising. And this information comes from a woman on the internet who claims to be Obama's second cousin and describes a lot of details that seem to check out to me. So I would just point out, whether or not that's true, I would say once again, in my perspective, that Corsi is playing a weaponized game where he's actually very likely leading people on red herring chases. And I've pointed out before that there's a lot of indications that a large portion of this attack on Obama and his birth certificate, especially the stuff about how he was actually born in Kenya, Let's remember too that some of there was aspects of this that came out via one Sidney Blumenthal actually early on, playing the role of the Karl Rove to Hillary Clinton in many ways, who was part of sort of bringing up some of these rumors and publishing.
That was according to a former McClatchy newspaper editor.
Yes. So I do think that it looks like, from my perspective, it looks like a lot of the birther, what's been termed the birther conspiracy theories, was very much seemed to have a nodal point and a sort of a weight out of it was very Israeli. It seemed very Israeli to me. And whether it's people like Corsi or people like Orly Taitz, who's actually an Israeli dentist, I guess, living in Orange County. She was a key figure in that. Or even Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who more and more we see as very much in this sphere of this Russian-Israeli kind of propaganda network, even in the Trump era.
Two more names in there real quick. Joel Gilbert, the filmmaker who made Dreams from My Real Father. He is now a semi-regular host on InfoWars. You have Joel Gilbert, and then you also have Aaron Klein, who was in a lot of ways Jerome Corsi's partner in crime at WorldNet Daily. Aaron Klein, who now heads the Breitbart Jerusalem Bureau, who has been credited by Steve Bannon personally as being the person who had the idea of bringing Bill Clinton's rape accusers to the presidential debate and sit them in the front row. And these are tactics as the head of Breitbart Jerusalem. This is very obviously being done on behalf of the interests of someone like an Aaron Klein and those who are the benefactors at Breitbart are benefiting and or working on behalf of in terms of Israel. And it seems to really be in line with this very hard right Likud oriented, or even to be further to the right of the Likud as we're seeing with current events in Israel, what those interests represents. Those are two more people that are directly involved at a very key level with this whole Obama's fake birth certificate. And a lot of the other theories surrounding Obama's actually a Muslim and he's sympathetic and he's trying to help basically jihadists take over the country. And then, of course, that goes into what Frank Gaffney makes his career off of at the Center for Security Policy and people like that. So
thank you for bringing that up, too, because Joel Gilbert is arch Zionist operative. And it also plays in the way the Dreams of My Real Father. It's that somehow Obama's supposed to look like Frank Marshall Davis, like the uber sort of communist radical, but he doesn't look like him at all. But so that what you see is killing two birds with one stone from the reactionary Zionist right, calling into question Obama's legitimacy in terms of being an American citizen, at the same time as associating him as out of the sort of the arch communist left. And that's why he's trying to destroy America with the Mecha and the Mecca and the taking, so that you can see that this is, there's a lot of this running in concert. And then Gilbert's current film, documentary so-called, in the Trump era is very much just a reinstantiation of considering that Trump is successful because of the specific aspects of the cult of personality that surround him and how he's so effective at using his personality to take down his opponents. So it's sort of pretty interesting. And then so you see Corsi following up from Where's the Birth Certificate with 2012 Saul Alinsky, the evil genius behind Obama, right? And then finally in 2013 you have Who Really Killed Kennedy? 50 years later, stunning new revelations about the JFK assassination, also published by WorldNet Daily. And as I have pointed out that both Corsi and Stone have written Kennedy conspiracy books, and it looks like to me, I have not read both of them, but it looks from reviews of them and aspects of it that I have read that they both finger Lyndon Baines Johnson and aspects, I think, potentially of the CIA as the epicenter of the conspiracy to kill Kennedy, which fits very much into the hypothesis of Laurent Guyonneau in his books about JFK to 9/11, but also from Yahweh to Zion, where he really talks about, and includes that, we will include a link to his article about the real unspoken, basically talking about how there's the CIA, and then there's Johnson, and then the real unspoken, the third aspect that's left out of it, of course, is Israel. And to me, it looks like that both Corsi and Stone are the perfect perpetrators of this kind of cover-up.
Even in reference to that, you asked, there was a case where Jerome Corsi was doing one of his live streams where people in the chat began bringing up the USS Liberty, and he started railing on about the anti-Semites, and we don't welcome anti-Semites on this live stream. So there, in that way, if you're all about Johnson, I mean, that was one of the most egregious criminal acts of the Johnson administration that he directly covered up. So you have that as well. And real quick, I want to mention Corsi now has been touting an ebook that he's written called How the Democratic Party Went Communist. So you can obviously tell by the title of that what narrative he's pushing with that and how that aids the current political and social landscape. So.
All right, very good. And we only have a few minutes. I do want to deliver at least a little bit of that John Birch background, but then this last book that Corsi has written this year is Killing the Deep State: The Fight to Save President Trump. All right, so we'll leave that uncommented upon. But
yeah, and I believe in that rails on at the Obama administration for interfering in Israel's election. So
yes, and so I do want to read a little bit from an article about the John Birch Society by DC Dave. And this basically, first it sort of talks about how the background of the John Birch Society, he met a Birch guy who was a 33rd degree Freemason who knew the Welches. Robert Welch was one of the founders. He told me that Welch's brother James was also a 33rd degree Freemason. Eustace Mullins wrote in Murder by Injection that Robert Welch was a 32nd degree Mason. Then also it talks about how it was a corral for conservatives. But here's what I want to read from. JBS was a Zionist operation and became virulently so with the hiring of John Rees, the Israeli intelligence agent. A British Zionist, Rees hated me personally for no apparent reason, probably instinctive, maybe because of my background as an anti-communist, quote, mercenary in Africa. But Welch ran JBS as a cheering section for Likud, referring to Begin and Sharon and Shamir as anti-communist, anti-terrorist, etc. So the ADL had a direct control over Welch, and he would brook no discussion of Jewish aims or practices, or as I said before, the Jewish creation of communism. I know because it was my duty as a staff coordinator to expel any member who discussed Jews in a political manner. I never had to do this because by 1979, the membership was thoroughly tamed and compliant. And so we just want to point out in this last minute here that even this anti-communism aspect, this guy John Rees, identified as an Israeli intelligence agent here, ends up helping create the Western Goals Foundation with one John Singlob and other elements of the Iran-Contra group, and basically as an anti-communist group. But then they end up teaming up with the Anti-Defamation League to do the domestic spying operation, especially in relationship to political opponents of apartheid South Africa and of apartheid Israel. And so here we are in our 10 seconds, and we begin to see this idea. The last 10 seconds, we see that, yes, the endpoints of our discussion have been hijacked and constructed, and it does not mean that there's not something substantially there in the sort of radical middle of our reality, but in order to get there, it's going to take diving beyond these false surface level operations. So until next week, Antidote, we out.
All right, till next time.